Ghost Rider is a Marvel Comics character that's actually multiple characters, but we'll get more into that in a second. But his first appearance was in Marvel Spotlight number 5 in August of 1972. Before that time, there was a character known as Ghost Rider that was more of a Western character, but he was later changed to the name Phantom Rider so that they could have this newer Ghost Rider character, and that first one would be the motorcycle stuntman Johnny Blaze. While Johnny Blaze is the character that a lot of people will recognize as Ghost Rider, there was also a popular run in the 90s where Ghost Rider was someone named Danny Ketch, and more recently there was Robbie Reyes, who was seen in the TV series Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Now, despite Ghost Rider being around for decades and being a super popular character with multiple variations to pick from to make games based on, for the most part, Ghost Rider has just been a character that shows up in a cast of multiple characters to pick from, or just a side character. There's only one game that came out where Ghost Rider was the sole focus of the story and the main character that you play as, and that's 2007's Ghost Rider, which was released to tie into the movie of the same year. So as I previously mentioned, the Ghost Rider character has appeared in many other games, but the 2007 one was the only one that he actually starred in. The Danny Ketch version was going to get his own video game made by Crystal Dynamics in 1997 for the Sony PlayStation, but unfortunately, ultimately that game was canceled. It really makes you wonder what could have been if that had been made. So fast forward a full decade later, and in February of 2007, there's a PlayStation 2, PSP, and GBA game that is released from 2K Games. Obviously, the main attraction would be the PlayStation 2 game, which was developed by Climax Action, which was part of Climax Studios. Climax is a British developer that's not to be confused with Climax Entertainment from Japan, and they did a lot of ports of games to home computers and portables, but they are most arguably known for doing the action RPG Sudeki on the Xbox, ATV Off-Road Fury 3 and 4 on the PS2, Hot Wheels Stunt Track Challenge on the PS2, Xbox, and PC, and Silent Hill Origins and Silent Hill Shattered Memories, which came out on PS2 and other platforms. Climax Studios still exists to this day, and they continue to port games to other platforms, as well as doing assisted development like they did for Returnal on the PS5 and PC. The plot of Ghost Rider on PS2 is a story that takes place after the movie, which allows it to be able to have some different locations and characters and not having to worry about following the movie too closely. They actually hired Marvel writers Garth Ennis and Jimmy Palmiotti to do the storyline. Demons keep escaping from hell and Mephisto needs to keep them in control, so he gets the help from Ghost Rider. Of course, Johnny Blaze refuses, so Mephisto does what Mephisto does, and he sends Vengeance to kill Roxanne, which is the love interest of Johnny Blaze. This kicks off all the events that happen in the game, which just basically boils down to Johnny Blaze reluctantly helping out Mephisto to capture these demons and send them back to hell. Admittedly, the story is very thin despite hiring some big names to write it, and it's only told once you beat a level that has a bit of a comic book style cutscene that plays afterward. These happen few and far between, and even if you pay attention, there isn't really much to it. It's just an excuse for you to go around and kill things. And despite being a tie-in to the movie, the likenesses used do not really match up with any of the actors in the movie, with the exception of Sam Elliott for whatever reason. Probably because he's the coolest dude in the movie. As I mentioned though, this does allow for more characters to show up that weren't in the movie, which is kind of a cool aspect to it. And it even has a cameo appearance by Blade.
Hello.
Sorry, I should have said spoiler alert, but honestly, is it really much of a spoiler? It's not that great of a story. But yeah, he kind of helps you off in a little comic book style cutscene and then never actually shows up in the game until you actually beat the game, and then you can unlock playing as Blade as another option. So how does Ghost Rider actually play? Well, it is very much like Devil May Cry or God of War style fast-paced combat. I kind of wanted to make a joke about, since it's Devil May Cry, that maybe we'd call it Mephisto May Cry, but yeah, it's just bad, I know, I'm sorry. But yeah, it's very similar to those games. The controls are similar, especially to God of War. You have the right stick that's used to dodge and roll, and the circle button is used to do execution finishing moves, although they're not really that interesting in this game. To further draw comparisons to God of War, Ghost Rider himself uses chains to attack, and it's very similar to the way that Kratos does his attacks. You do square and triangle to mix up between light and heavy attacks, X is jump, circle is to do the grabs that I talked about before, and then you use the shoulder buttons for blocking using your shotgun, and there are 2 different kinds of specials that each have their own meters that you can use. One is a wide area killer, and the other makes you attack faster, and then you can do your penance stare, which gives you extra souls. These souls are important because that's what you use to buy your upgrades, both for your stats as well as unlocking new combos and moves that you can do. Once you've unlocked all of those, you can still continue to unlock more bonus extras like an art gallery, behind the scenes videos, and even some comic book pages. I've never been one to care much about art galleries, but they are there, and so that's going to be up to you whether or not that's going to be something that you're going to enjoy. But I did enjoy watching the behind the scenes videos. It was kind of cool to see the story about how they made the game, how they had to kind of change some things around because Marvel didn't like certain things they were doing, or if they found something that wasn't working right. And then the comic books were, I think, were the biggest disappointment. I was thinking you were going to unlock an entire comic book to read, but really it was just a few pages here and there, just kind of some iconic imagery and not really able to let you read a whole story. That on top of the fact that you're reading in standard definition, so even when you zoom in, it gets kind of fuzzy and blurry. Gameplay sometimes is mixed up a bit, where instead of having the God of War style levels, you're now going to have levels where you're riding around on your motorcycle. In these levels, you can still whip your chains at enemies as well as shooting hellfire, and you have to survive to a specific endpoint. While you're on your way to that endpoint and you have all those enemies trying to drain you of all your health, you'll also need to worry about being able to complete some stunts that need to be done, like jumping over pits or sliding under obstacles. The controls in the bike levels are pretty straightforward, where you have square and triangle to whip your chains left and right respectively, as well as X to jump and circle to do the hellfire. L1 and R1 are used for brake and accelerate, and I gotta tell you, I do not miss the days of R1 to accelerate in racing games and shooting in first-person shooters, but that's neither here nor there. It is serviceable, and it's not really anything that warrants any kind of analog control. On top of Blade being an unlockable character that does play a bit differently from Johnny Blaze, as he doesn't have special moves, depending on what difficulty level you complete the game in, you can also unlock Classic Ghost Rider, Ghost Rider 2099, and Vengeance. There are certainly camera issues, as was common at the time, especially since you don't have the right stick to move the camera around. You can just click the right stick in to center your view, but that has varying degrees of success. Sometimes the camera's still locked and doesn't let you do it. Other times it just still snaps awkwardly and you don't really know where you need to go. It's not the best system, and I would have rather be able to move the camera with the right stick, but I didn't design the game, and so we just have to deal with it as the players. There are 5 areas that you can play through in the game that each have multiple levels within them. Each area does look different, so there is some variety in that sense, and they do try to introduce some new enemies in each one of these areas, but you do end up fighting the same enemies over and over and over again. And 5 areas still really isn't all that much. In the end, it is a rather short game, and you can beat it in just a few hours. Also, the upgrades come very easily, and you'll have all of them within the first hour to hour and a half, and you're going to find yourself just spamming the most powerful attacks and combos that you have, or in the bike level shooting the homing hellfire at the enemies. When it comes to the graphics, it is a late era PS2 game, so it is better than a lot of other games that you will see on the system, especially considering that it's a tie-in game, but it's still nothing super special. It does even include a widescreen mode, but since the PS2 doesn't output 16:9 natively, it just changes the way that the screen is rendered, so you have to change your display to 16:9 stretch mode. It runs pretty well too, but the lack of enemy variety and a lot of basic geometry as well as small play areas probably play into that. There was originally consideration to make an Xbox version, and I'm very curious what would have happened if that one actually came to be. It was ultimately canceled, but that little bit more hardware behind it could have made this game just a little bit over the tipping point, as there is still some fun to be had, and the graphics definitely need a little bit of work. The sound department also has some sound effects that are nice and clear and crisp, but you're going to hear the same handful of quips over and over again, with the only extra variety being that there are some optional taunts that you could do with the select button, but again, there's only a few of those that you're going to hear. There is some voice acting that go in the comic book style cutscenes as well, but don't expect any of the actors to reprise their roles from the movie. Unfortunately, the music is a major low point when it comes to Ghost Rider, as it's ultra generic 2000s style butt rock with some electronic elements. It did nothing for me and was a bit grating at times. I just found myself tuning it out, taking my headphones off, and at one point I even just turned down the volume within the game so I could still hear the sound effects and just put something else on that I'd rather listen to. Next up is the PlayStation Portable, aka PSP version of Ghost Rider, which was based on the PS2 game. It uses the same assets and has the same levels, but they are made into smaller chunks. This is most likely to make it more portable friendly, and the levels can be finished within just a few minutes each time. In the PS2 version, even with the small play areas that they had, it would still have you fight off a group of enemies and then you could walk off to another section to fight some more. In the PSP version, you just fight in one smaller chunk of those levels and then you walk to kind of this blue glowing section after you beat them to trigger a new group of enemies. Anything that requires you to move on to a new, fully different section is actually a totally different level for you to play. The PSP's lack of a right stick leads to issues with dodging, and specials are tied to the D-pad, which is going to be a bit troublesome as that's awkward to reach in the middle of a heated battle. Ghost Rider on PSP does give you the choice between having a more zoomed in view or being able to see a bit more of the play area with a zoomed out view, but obviously it's on the smaller little PSP screen, so you might not always want to do that. The PSP version of Ghost Rider still has you collecting souls as you defeat enemies, but they're no longer used for doing the upgrades, and it's more of a score system. Instead, each level has a set of what they call skull challenges, and when you complete them, you'll earn a skull for doing so, and each unlock now has a certain amount of skulls that you'll need to be able to unlock them. These challenges are usually in the form of taking underneath a certain number of hits, collecting a certain number of souls, or beating a level under a certain amount of time. Each level generally only has about 3 challenges, and each one will give you 1 skull. So instead of having to do 2,000 souls to unlock something, you're now looking at maybe doing 2 or 3 skulls to do so. Interestingly enough, there are actually a couple of exclusive modes to the PSP version. You have challenge mode and multiplayer mode. Now, I don't know anybody else with a PSP right now, so I really couldn't try out the multiplayer at this point in time, but I do believe that it was a racing mode where you can compete against your friends, and there was even an option that said game sharing. The challenge mode is a single-player mode that involves racing, and you have to think something like Mario Kart. You're racing around a course that you pick after picking which character you're going to play, as they each have their own different stats. Along the way of racing, you can pick up power-ups and attacks, and it's just a simple way to be able to kill some time that's a little bit different from the main game. Within the challenge mode, there are 3 different ways to race. You have your regular racing mode, that's the circuit mode. You have eliminator mode, where the person in last place each lap is eliminated, and infection mode, where you have your health constantly draining as you get infected, and as the laps go on, that infection gets stronger and stronger, so you have to stay ahead of everybody else to outlive them. Part of me does appreciate that the PSP version isn't just an exact clone of the PS2 version, but another part of me thinks that maybe they should have tried a little bit more. I don't know. It was kind of cool to be able to play something a bit different, but since the PS2 game isn't the best building block to start off of, it does kind of get real shallow real quick. Finally, we have the Game Boy Advance version, which I have to say was really something that took me by surprise and is a bit of a hidden gem, kind of. This version was not developed by Climax and instead was by Magic Pockets, which are based out of France. They've mostly done GBA and DS games for the majority of their catalog, doing ports, but they have done some original games like Inspector Gadget Advance Mission, Gremlin Stripe vs. Gizmo, and Popeye Rush for Spinach. They also did Road Rash Jailbreak on the Game Boy Advance, and this is important for you to remember, but just bear with me a moment. At the time of development for Ghost Rider, they were owned by 2K, but they do still exist today as an independent studio. This game is more like a 2D side-scroller as opposed to trying to do a full 3D game, which makes sense considering the hardware that it's on. It feels almost like it's a long-lost Super Nintendo game, and that's something that really appealed to me while playing it. After playing this game to make this video, I was looking around online and I saw a lot of people making comparisons to the early Castlevania games. I kind of see where they're coming from. It is based more on being able to do platforming and completing levels and less on the RPG elements and exploration, but it doesn't really feel like Castlevania otherwise, and you do still have those RPG elements of collecting the souls and buying some upgrades. It has a beautiful 16-bit style that has that cool pixel art that I love to see on the Game Boy Advance, but there's not a whole lot of variety to the enemies, and you're going to fight the same ones over and over. But then again, that was the case with its older brother on the PS2. You still have the same 5 areas that were on the PS2 version of the game, so it's kind of cool to see little reimaginings of those areas. But again, you're fighting the same characters over and over again, and you have like bosses that are kind of these pre-rendered sprites that look a little bit different and almost out of place. And you just, once you see them over and over again, it just gets real old real fast. But other than that, it is still fun to play. You're still unlocking new moves and getting other upgrades, and it does use the cartridge to save it so you don't have to do it all in one sitting. It is still, unfortunately, a very short game that can be completed in just a matter of hours, so saving it isn't necessarily always going to be needed. But there are multiple difficulty levels that you can play, and if you go through again on the hardest difficulty level, there are new areas of the levels to explore. Another little side note that I feel like I should bring up is that this is one of those few games that does support a sleep mode. And I just don't really understand why. Like, I get it, the Game Boy Advance didn't have a proper sleep mode, and you want to be able to save battery and stuff, but the levels are so short, I feel like you'd be able to finish it and get to a save point before you really needed to be able to turn it off, but you know, whatever. It is an option. It is there for those of you that care. Okay, now this is the point where I'm checking to see if you were paying attention. So yes, it did have the action levels, but it still has the motorcycle levels too, just like the PSP and PS2 versions. And those levels play just like, I want to hear everybody say it at the same time. That's right, it plays like Road Rash. I thought that when I was playing the game initially, and when I was doing some research, I found out that they developed the Game Boy Advance port of Jailbreak, so it all totally makes sense. It looks and plays exactly the same. So the Game Boy Advance version is fun in short bursts, and you can have the option to go back and play earlier levels if you want to be able to get some more upgrades to be able to help you out later on. Although I don't really think you'll need it, it's still a pretty short and easy game. But it did feel almost at times that it was more inspired than the console game. The music and sound in general, unfortunately, are something that very much could have been improved. It's all highly compressed with a lot of clipping and things getting cut off while it's playing. This makes the music that was already grating on the PS2 even more unbearable to listen to, as it just has a quality to it that's just awful and sounds even more outdated, even in 2007. Found myself just playing this like any other portable that I've played throughout my years as a gamer, and that is silently. So unfortunately for Ghost Rider fans, there is only one game out there that has his name attached to it where he is the star, and it's not the best example of doing so. With that said, there are 3 different versions that have their own differences to them that warrant their existence, and they each have their own pros and cons, but the cons do outweigh a lot of the pros. I do remember back in the day having the PS2 version that I played on my PS3 after it dropped to $20, and I didn't feel like I wasted my money as I got about $20 worth. It was a fun short experience even though it wasn't the greatest thing that I had played. It hasn't aged all that well, and there are a lot of better examples of games like that out there, but fans might still want to check it out if you want a little simple experience. The Game Boy Advance version, as I said, was also a little bit of a surprise, and there's definitely something there for fans to be able to sink their teeth into. No matter which version you want to go to, thankfully they're not super rare or collectible, and so you can get them for a relatively cheap price. So thanks again for watching. Who out there is already a fan of Ghost Rider who wants another game? What style game would you like it to be? Have you played other games that Ghost Rider has been in, and what is your favorite there? Thank you again, and until next time, enjoy gaming.